Do what? Sure, no problem. You didn't see it? Oh, well. Well, everybody loses something here at some point. You can go to Wally World and pick you up a new pair. Not a problem. We're ready to go? All right. We're on. People are watching, hopefully. We welcome anybody who is watching by YouTube tonight. Glad that you're tuning in. We're in Hebrews chapter 11, going to finish out chapter 11 tonight. Before we get started, for you all who are here, if you're using the Bible study plan that I set out, I've got February's copy out on the table back there, and you're welcome to take that if you'd like. I know some people have, and glad for that, and I'll try to have it out each month in advance of the first of the month. Won't guarantee anything, but that's what I'm going to try to do. 2 weeks from tonight, well, next week I will not be here, but we'll still be here. Stephanie's going to lead the Bible study time and prayer concerns time. I've got to be up in Northern Virginia to do a doctor's appointment, annual checkup. And so she will be here to carry that on. The next Wednesday night is Ash Wednesday, the 14th. So we won't have regular Wednesday night program. We won't have a meal. The service will be at 6. And so we won't have a meal that night. We'll come here for the service at 6. Choir will meet at 7 o'clock. The children's programs will not be held that night, so that we all can have that service on the 14th. So that's Ash Wednesday. That's the beginning of Lent. The newsletter went out today, and you'll see all the information about that as well. I hope you picked up one of these sheets of paper. Yours is white. Mine is tan. It's from 2 Maccabees. And when you get bored and start looking for something to read while I'm talking, if you pick up at verse 18 of chapter 6, that's where we're going to read from verse 18 through to the end. It tells the story of Eleazar, who was a priest who refused to bow the knee to the pagan gods and lost his life for it. We're going to work that into our conversation here tonight. We're picking up where we left off last week with an issue, a critical issue that was raised. David was asking about it. If you look in what we read last week, if you have your Bible with you, or pick out one from the rack in front of you, in chapter 11, let's see, where is it? Verse 27, verses 23 through 28 are talking about Moses primarily and the people of Israel, and talking about the faith of Moses. The whole of the chapter is talking about the faith of Israel's great heroes. And in this particular section, it's highlighting the faith of Moses, his parents, and the people of Israel. In verse 27, it says, "By faith Moses left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger." David objected to that. Got to give you a little grief. Because if you read in Exodus, the actual Old Testament reporting of this account, here's what you will read. I'm actually going to it's Exodus chapter 2. This is a Bible drill night, so you know how we used to do that in the old days. You can turn to Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to read from verse 11:4, telling you the whole of this particular part of Moses' story. "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man that did the wrong, 'Why do you strike your fellow?' He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. So, is the author of Hebrews misinterpreting or embellishing the story? What's the reason for the difference between the two? That question was raised. I can't give you a complete answer because the author of Hebrews is not here to tell you. But I can tell you what we know about the information the author of Hebrews has. When we talked about the priesthood of Melchizedek, if you remember, I told you that a lot of that about the Melchizedek and being the messianic priest, a figure for the messianic priest, that's not really in your Bibles. It's more in the tradition surrounding our Bibles. The tradition of the priests and the rabbis and the scribes in Israel. And it's obvious that the author of Hebrews was borrowing from that larger tradition that the people of Israel would be familiar with through all the discourses they'd heard and all the information they'd had passed along. That's where he's getting his information from. For us, he's using some of the biblical texts, but he's really pulling more from traditions beyond what we have in the biblical text. It's the same thing. My conjecture is it's the same thing here, as far as we can tell. There are two philosopher, historian, writers in the first century, Philo of Alexandria, who was a learned Jew, a philosopher, Josephus, who was a historian in the same time, Jewish, and in their writings about Moses, their take on Moses' story is not that he was fearful as we read it. We read it straight from the text, and we see he's fearful and he was running from Pharaoh. Their take of Moses is bigger picture, and the understanding from that traditional view of Moses was that he wasn't as afraid as it appears he was. Now, you may say they're embellishing his story, and you can make all sorts of arguments all day long, but it appears that the author of Hebrews is continuing to borrow from that tradition in order to flesh out, to talk about Moses, the whole arc of his story. As I said last week, too, when we talk about people as being exemplars of the faith, and for instance, when Paul talks about Abraham never having wavered about the promise that, that Isaac was going to be born to him, well, we know he wavered. We know from the Old Testament that he and Sarah decided to figure out a different way to get the heir into the world, and that's where Hagar came from, or that's where Hagar was involved. We also know that, he himself, in the text, you can see some of his uncertainty about things there. So it's not that Abraham, in having faith, always demonstrated perfect faith all along the way. No, it's that as his faith was being displayed, it's that kind of tug of war type of thing. It's like the psalmists. If you read the psalmists, many of the psalms, you will see, both great, you're going to save me, you're going to save me, you're going to save me. And then in the same psalm, you'll hear him talk about, where are you? Why have you left us high and dry? That's the testimony of faith. It's a back and forth. And so a person of great faith is a person who has gone through doubt, who has struggled with uncertainty, who has struggled with fear. That was my way of approaching this text. So there are those two things. And again, it's obvious that the author of Hebrews is pulling from the larger tradition. One more evidence of that, if you go back to the Hebrews 11 passage there, Hebrews 11, a few verses back up from verse 27. where it says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Where's that in the Old Testament text? It's not there. Not per se. Now, you can make a case in the Exodus text that where Moses, verse 11 of chapter 2 in Exodus, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked at their burdens. And you can see in that passage, perhaps, a sign that Moses decided to identify with his people. Now, the tradition takes that information and adds to it and comes up with, Moses deliberately chooses to leave his people, leave the Egyptians and become the Hebrew who he is. And you see an example of that in the Ten Commandments movie, the Cecil B. DeMille version of this story. So again, the larger tradition that surrounds this, that we don't have access to, that the author of Hebrews was drawing upon in some respect throughout, I think is what's responsible for this different reading of this incident than what you find in Exodus. Now, that's my theory. You could stick with yours if you whatever else you might have. Scotty? Right, and that's one way that some will try to take the text and make those kinds of arguments. Some scholars have said that what this passage in chapter 11 is talking about is not when he left Egypt to go into the desert, but rather when he took the people of Israel and left. That it was referring to that, and that he didn't have any fear that Pharaoh would come after him. That's hard to substantiate because in the next verse, verse 28, he's talking about the Passover and how he demonstrated faith by having the doorpost sprinkled at Passover. Well, Passover happened before he left Egypt. So the chronology here wouldn't play out if that were the case. But there are some scholars who still will argue that. So it's a conundrum. Those are some ways to come at it and to think about it. Any other questions or thoughts or comments about it? It is a legitimate conundrum. It is, no doubt. All right, we pick up where we are then with our next verses 32 and following. We're just reading through the end of this chapter because we have plenty that we can think about here as well. Verse 32, and what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, and who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better so that they would not, without us, be made perfect. Remember, he's finishing up his argument. The whole of chapter 11, he's naming all these heroes of the faith and how they were faithful in the face of all sorts of trial and tribulation and persecution and trouble, and that they were faithful because they kept their eye beyond this life on the life to come. They kept their eye on eternal glory. That's his argument, and he's making this argument to the believers under his care, many of whom were Jewish Christian believers who were giving up the Christian part of that and going back to their Jewish tradition. And he's trying to encourage them to stay the course. Why are they going back? Because they're facing persecution. And so he's making the case in chapter 11. Look at the heroes of the faith. Look how they looked beyond the trouble that stood before them to the promised land, the kingdom beyond this life. And he starts naming them, and that's what he's talking about here. So he's finishing up the list here in these last verses. And the first set of people he's talking about, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, they're all judges, right? If you don't you recognize some of those names, you may not recognize all of them. They're from the book of Judges, and they're all judges, or they were raised up as leaders. Remember, the judge in the book of Judges, those are local leaders who are raised up by God to carry out deliverance of God's people in the midst of trouble. This is before the kingdom has been established. This is before Samuel who anoints Saul, and then who anoints David to be king. This is before Israel becomes a kingdom. This is when they are a confederation of tribes living in the promised land. They've entered the promised land. They've fought battles against many of the peoples who lived there, and they've dispossessed those people of that land to a certain extent, even though many of them still lived in that territory. And so this is how they're making do in these days. And so when trouble would rise up, when some of these pagan peoples would fight to take back their land or would, afflict the Israelites in some other way, then God would raise up a leader to fight the battle, to lead the charge and to fight the battles. These are some of those leaders. Now, let's say right off the bat, to call these people, paragons of virtue is a big stretch. All of these guys, they're not as heroic looking, because of what we know, as we wish they were, perhaps. We'll say something more about that in just a second. Gideon, for instance. Gideon, he likes to complain about how bad things are, and he complains that God hadn't done anything about it, but when God comes and tells him he's chosen him to do something about it, he backs off. He doesn't want to do it. And Gideon has to be convinced again and again and again that God will be with him. So Gideon's not the strongest of leaders on the front end of things. And then on the back end of things, he turns out to be a pretty ruthless kind of character. But God raises him up and uses him to defeat the Midianites in a great campaign. And he ultimately expressed faith in God's call upon his life. He answered the call, and he did the work. And so God was able, through him, to save the people. Barak, he's tied to Deborah. Deborah is the judge, and God instructs Deborah to raise up the Israelites to fight against a certain king and certain pagan peoples. And God evidently calls Deborah to call Barak to take the charge. And Barak says, I won't do it unless you go with me. He's not a fearless leader. He is a fearful leader. And so she goes with him, but she tells him, for that, you're not going to get to claim the glory for this. Actually, a woman will be the one who will take the life of the king.
Yeah, actually, that's the point. Because I notice here, he doesn't give Deborah credit. She's the one that has.
I know.
He's not giving Deborah the credit. You see a real show.
There you go.
By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents. He doesn't give credit to his mother. She's the one that.
Right.
So, why is that? Does he not think women have?
Well, maybe because Barak is more known in that larger tradition. Again, he's borrowing from more than what we have before us. And so I can't answer that question exactly. But yes, Deborah is the one who really deserves more of the credit for this whole scene. And then it's Jael is the woman who actually takes the life of the king who has come to her for hiding when Barak's forces have overwhelmed the pagan peoples. Do what now? Yeah, Paul mentions women too. Paul's, that's a discussion for another day. The next person, Samson, good old Samson, who has an eye for the women, and then some. Samson is not a very virtuous man. Yeah, but God uses him, gives him strength, and he fritters it away. He ends up defeating the Philistines finally, but it's a roundabout sort of way. So again, he's not a great hero of the faith, but he still does what he's called to do, even though it takes him a rocky course to get there to do it. Jephthah, he doesn't start off being a very good prospect. He's the son of a prostitute. And so he has a chip on his shoulder, legitimately so. But he rises up and he does the bidding that he's called to do. He answers the call to faith to save God's people. But he is too much of this world, and he promises that if God gives him the victory, he'll sacrifice the first person who walks through the door, which is a pagan practice, which shows that even as he is serving God, he has still got pagan ways about him. And unfortunately, the first person who comes to the door after he does all this is his daughter. And so, tragic story there. So those guys aren't the best. They're not our candidates for heroes of the faith. Why in the world would the author of Hebrews bring them out? I mean, Gideon we can understand pretty much, but the other, and Samson has, because of his great strength and all. Why does he do them? Can't say. Again, where he's working from, the people he's talking to, there's some extenuating circumstances that I think help to guide him in making these selections. There is, though, I think, a word for us from all this, as I wrote in the notes there, and that is, we're in a day and age where heroes have to be perfect, or we do away with them. And we just keep doing away with our heroes right and left and right and left and right and left. And I don't want to get into the politics of all this kind of stuff. But we've got this insane notion that if we can find something, unseemly in our heroes, sinful in our heroes, that therefore cancels out everything good that they did. And I think the testimony of this story is, you know what? None of these guys were great guys. They had their moments. They served God and answered the bell when they were called, and they are exemplars of faith in that respect, but they also have their unseemly parts to their lives. Israel still sees them as heroes. Even David, who's mentioned here next, I mean, he sends a man to his death in order to cover up his infidelity. David's worst moment is really, really, really bad. So, again, I think this word helps us to understand all our heroes are human beings, and all our heroes are fallen human beings. And we have to come to grips with being able to hold on to what was good and noteworthy in their lives, even as we, don't affirm that which is bad. But, we can still say that the good things that were done are good, I think. You don't have to, if you do this, you're never going to have any heroes. Because if you look deep enough, you're going to find some flaw in every single hero that's lifted up. You will. And that's part of the conversation that's carried out too. Right.
Deuteronomy chapter 18, which we read on Sunday for a part of it. The first part of that chapter 18, it expressly talks about this is one of the detestable practices of the people around you. People who sacrifice don't, it's forbidden. You just can't get around how you could reject it.
Yeah. That's another aspect of it. Right. The foolishness of that, yeah. I'm not a big fan of Samson myself. So, and again, but they answered the call to faith. And they put their lives on the line in many respects, in all those respects. So, again, that I think that is a modern point that is worth bringing out. Again, it's not to excuse the sins of people or the bad things that have been done. It's not to excuse it, but I think it is to try and understand the complexity of dealing with evil in human nature. We're all fallen, and we all, as much as we can be heroic in some moments, we can be pretty bad in other moments as well. Exercise of faith. God's called me to do something. It's hard to do, and they do it anyway. That's the nature of it. And they do it in the face of danger, and the author of Hebrews argues they do it because they looked beyond the present danger to a greater good.
We could say they sinned, they did terrible things, and therefore they will not be accepted in heaven. And yet, if they live by faith, that's the determination.
Judgment's a whole other thing here. The final balance, the final day of judgment, that's beyond what we can even begin to think about with them. In these moments, they exercised faith. They were exemplars of faith for the people of Israel. They risked their lives for the sake of doing. Right. Well, the good thing is you have two people who are really good heroes right after them, David and Samuel. And so we can certainly rejoice in them. The prophets are not named, but you know the prophets and you know what they did. And we actually see the prophets referenced through the next set of verses in the next verses 33, 34. These are you can hear the prophets' stories and David and Samuel and these others through these. Verse 33, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions. We think of Daniel there. Quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Verse 35, women received their dead by resurrection. What in the world does that refer to? The two women that Elijah and Elisha dealt with. Remember their sons, the Shunammite woman and the widow from Zarephath? They both had children who died, and both of them were raised to new life. And so surely the reference there is to what God did for them through his prophets. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. These are those who suffered the martyr's death. Then instead of recanting the faith, they died professing the faith. And that's where I want you to look at Eleazar. I'm just going to point you to his example. We won't read it through it all since we're a little late. This is from 2 Maccabees, which, of course, is talking about the period of the Maccabees when the temple had been invaded by the Seleucid rulers. The pagan idols had been set up there. Sacrifices had been offered there. And the complete desecration of the temple, and the priests and the other religious leaders there were being asked to participate in it. Eleazar is a scribe who will not do it. And you can read from verses 18 through the end. I'll let you do that on your own time. Powerful stuff there of his holding firm in the face of death. And just an example of what we're talking about here, not that the author of Hebrews is necessarily referring to Eleazar, but to persons who made similar stands for the faith. Verse 36, others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. You think of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. They were sawn in two. There's a tradition that says that Isaiah was sawn in two. I had not known that till I was studying up on this passage, but there's an extra biblical tradition that says the prophet Isaiah was sawn in two. And that must have been what he's referring to here. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats. You think about the martyrs in Rome under persecution from Nero who would dress up the people in animal skins, and they would be fed to or taken out in front of the lions in the Colosseum. Destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God. Hebrews is pointing to the day of judgment, the day when all accounts will be settled, the day when the kingdom will be brought in, the day when all the redeemed of the Lord will be raised to new life to enter into the kingdom. They haven't entered into that yet. Though they are in heaven, they still await the final resurrection, even as those who are on earth still wait the final resurrection. All will be raised at once to enter into the kingdom, and so that's what he seems to be referring to here. They will not be made perfect without us. All will be made perfect at that one particular moment, and so all will realize the fulfillment of the promise. It wasn't just about getting into the land of Canaan. The promise extended beyond that to eternal glory. And that's what he's referring to here. If you remember in Revelation chapter 6, I believe it is. I've got it referenced in here somewhere. That's where we find the martyrs under the altar. Yeah, verse 6, chapter 6, verse 9 and following. The martyrs are under the altar, and they ask, "O Lord, when will you avenge our blood upon those who took our lives?" And he says, "Wait and rest until the number is complete." And so that's an image that comports with what we have here, that the final victory, the final enjoyment of eternal life will be joint. Nobody gets to experience it before everybody else does. Those who are gone from this life are in the presence of Almighty God and know a greater peace than we do, obviously, but they don't know yet the fullness of our redemption until we all know it on that great and glorious day. Whew. A lot of stuff there. Read that passage from 2 Maccabees. That's pretty good stuff, I think. Any last thoughts or questions? Comments? Chapter 12 is another great chapter, familiar to you, and we'll pick up with that next week. Thanks to all those who are watching by YouTube tonight. Glad that you've tuned in, and hope and pray God's blessings upon you for the remainder of this week. We now turn here in this place to our prayer concerns time.